On this episode of Newt's World, in the beginning, the FBI and CIA fought America's enemies at home and abroad. Now they are tools of a growing police state, attacking the left's political enemies and spying on ordinary American citizens. How did we get here? In his new book, Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains, former CIA operative J. Michael Waller shows how normal intelligence functions have given way to political correctness and never-ending pride propaganda, trapping agents in the diversity, equity, and inclusion House of Mirrors. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, J. Michael Waller, Senior Analyst for Strategy at the Center for Security Policy. His areas of expertise include foreign propaganda, political warfare, psychological warfare, and subversion. He holds a PhD in International Security Affairs from the Boston University. Michael, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
It's great to be with you.
You mentioned that it had been, 43 years since you guys were hanging out in my office?
The top of the Cannon House office building.
It's amazing how much time flies when you're having fun, isn't it?
It really is.
Walk me for a second in terms of your own life. What happened from college Republicans to today?
Well, I ended up getting involved with friends of yours, with Herb Romerstein and Faith Whittlesey and Morton Blackwell and others at the White House through college Republicans, and was the White House youth person for promoting Reagan's policy to roll back the Soviet Union. And they got me down with the Contras in Central America, and I did some work for Bill Casey, and then went on to become a professor and teaching a lot of what I learned.
That's great. Let's start with the nominations of Kash Patel as FBI director and Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence. First of all, why do you think President Trump was trying to achieve when he nominated them?
President Trump wanted some really tough people who simply don't care about being popular in Washington and playing the revolving door game to land some big contract or law firm partnership after heading their agencies. And so he picked a very tenacious person like Kash Patel with experience in the area to run the bureau. And that shocked a whole lot of people, but really there's no better person for the job. He picked someone like Tulsi Gabbard with a Democrat background who got burned badly by the security apparatus. She was labeled a suspected terrorist. She and her husband were labeled threats to aviation, even while she was a member of Congress. And she came around in a lot of her points of view as a result of that. So she, being personally stung, really has a good motivation to do the right thing.
I've known Tulsi Gabbard a long time. I really like her. I think she's very smart. Why would the intelligence community have done that?
She was a rogue Democrat. She was a critic of the system. So she was a threat. I don't see any other reason beyond that. People point to certain points of view she has, but they're simply points of view. But she was viewed as a public enemy. In
a sense, they've created their own monster.
Yeah.
This is one of those classic cases where if you strike, you had better win, because otherwise the person you attack gets bigger and stronger.
Yeah.
You had an article recently that was fascinating, entitled Why Some Senators Are So Afraid of Confirming Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard. It was in The Blaze on February 3rd. Why do you think they're that afraid?
They're afraid because Congress, for 49 years, has never held real oversight investigations or even hearings of the FBI or the CIA. There have been cursory ones, but no real hard skeptical oversight in any systemic way. I mean, you have even somebody like Chuck Schumer, who was elected in 1980. So he's been on the House and Senate Judiciary Committees for a total of 45 years. He never once tried to hold the FBI into account on anything. So you have these rogue apparatuses, which were more rogue than they were in the 1970s, and Congress hasn't looked. And it's natural human nature. If nobody's watching what you're doing, you're going to do what you feel like doing, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. So these institutions have gotten out of control and become politicized to the point where they will go after anyone who opposes them.
Because it's very obvious that President Trump is shaking things up in Washington. The latest big example is the way in which they've closed the doors of the U.S. Agency for International Development. literally, in fact, locking employees out. Now, you've had firsthand experience with AID, and you worked as a subcontractor for them in the 1990s. Can you walk us through your experience with AID?
Early on, I did some work in Latin America and some work in Russia. And in Latin America, they were just doing their job for development, for helping train civil society type things that were pretty legitimate, and they were consistent with U.S. foreign policy. It was always an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. But then after the Cold War, under the Clinton administration, these agencies were wondering what to do, and policymakers were wondering what are their purpose. And the Clinton administration flat out said at the time, you want to join the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House or Foreign Relations in the Senate to bring money back to your districts, using foreign policy to bring money back home. That means contracting money. That means money for your friends and cronies. That means money for the political causes that you want to produce, meaning using our foreign policy apparatus as a domestic liberal left political machine. And that's what happened to USAID. But I would argue AID went even further, and it became a state within a state, running its own foreign intelligence operations as operations to overthrow governments, regardless of what the president's policy was, and then to recruit and to assess and to finance and therefore control political operatives of other countries all around the world, not as an instrument of foreign policy, but as an instrument to itself and to this big corrupt political machine that it became.
At the time when we took USAID out of state, it's because we distrusted state. But then USAID evolved on its own into a system that I think is in many ways anti-American and certainly anti-Israeli. I was surprised in the last couple of days as they began to release this information with how much of the money was going into the U.S. through these nonprofits to finance left-wing operations. I mean, Politico apparently was being funded by USAID. Apparently Bill Kristol was getting money.
New York Times got millions.
25% of USAID's funding, $8 billion, was allocated to public international organizations rather than being spent directly by the United States. And it's pretty clear that in some places they were funding terrorist groups, they were funding people who are actively anti-American. As recently as October of 24, Senator Tom Cotton was raising questions because we've spent over $1 billion in humanitarian aid to Gaza, and all it did was make Hamas stronger.
Right. Yeah, USAID has been funding the civilian support infrastructures for insurgencies and for terrorist groups. Long ago, it was funding civilian support infrastructure for our friends and allies, but it's been doing it for Hamas. It's been doing it for a lot of extremist groups around the world. And it's also been used to wage sort of a cultural Marxist revolution in countries with traditional values. Look at what they've done in Guatemala, funding Marxist attorneys to become judges and then putting pressure on the Guatemalan government to force it to appoint them as justices to the high courts because Guatemalans won't elect a Marxist president. It's a conservative country. Look at what they're doing in Nigeria, promoting this LGBTQ, whatever else nonsense that goes against the values of practically every last Nigerian, but it's being shoved down their throats, and it's creating anti-Americanism among the populations at large, and then trying to build hostile systems that want to tear down Western values.
Do you think, in that sense, on balance, that USAID's programming has not advanced America's interests?
It hasn't since the collapse of the Cold War. I'll give you a good example. I saw it in the 1990s when I was working in Russia on the USAID Rule of Law project, working with the Russian parliament to build Frank Church-style oversight committees of the former KGB to make sure it could never rise again, and to expose and break apart the gangster state. It was a KGB gangster state that was developing in the 90s before this lieutenant colonel named Vladimir Putin ever went to Moscow. And so really, USAID had a big role in helping, inadvertently or otherwise, to build what became the Russian gangster state because it eviscerated the power of the Russian parliament to have oversight and have those oversight skills and knowledge that they needed.
In your book, Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains, you paint a pretty stark picture of the CIA and FBI's evolution from the Cold War heroes to what you call deep state villains. What were the key moments in history that marked this transformation?
Well, if you discount the human frailties that any human institution is going to have, and you look at the big picture of the purpose, the CIA and the FBI served their purposes by going after our foreign enemies abroad, FBI against domestic spies and subversives at home, and law enforcement here at home. But they were never in a position to abuse the American population at large, let alone, as Chuck Schumer warned several years ago, to have 6 ways from Sunday to go after you as a senior elected official of the U.S. government. It wasn't that way. Even J. Edgar Hoover didn't have the powers that today's FBI has, and as bad as he was in those certain areas, he did a lot of good also. He was never in a position to abuse power the way the FBI since James Comey has done, and Chris Wray. So the real shift came in the Obama administration, really in the Bush 43 administration, when there was this mass hiring of people who were poorly screened and often poorly qualified for their jobs at CIA. And they brought a lot of those West Coast, Silicon Valley, San Francisco values with them. But the real shift came when Barack Obama mandated it, with James Clapper as director of national intelligence, lifetime radical, just a lunatic radical when he was an Air Force general and head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And a counterintelligence problem, by the way. And then John Brennan as Obama's next CIA director, who was an unrepentant voter for the Communist Party candidate Gus Hall back 3 years before he was recruited into the CIA. And he laughs at it. He never used it as a teaching moment to say you can do stupid things as a kid, but this is how the enemy, our foreign enemies like the Soviets, are running operatives in the United States to recruit us and to subvert our system. He never once used that as a lesson. These people ran the intelligence community, and then you had Valerie Jarrett and others in the White House writing the Obama executive orders to impose critical theory, cultural Marxism, their manifestation under DEI throughout the whole intelligence community. And this corrupted the system.
You portray, particularly in the intelligence side, a really remarkable imposition, if you will, of leaders who are sort of knowingly not pro-American.
Yeah, they think America's a bad country.
I remember at one point Bremen arguing that there were really moderates in Hezbollah. And I think he had converted to Islam. I was thinking to myself, why would you have an intelligence chief who has this fantasy? Because there aren't any moderates in Hezbollah. Hezbollah is dedicated to the destruction of Israel and pretty cheerful about killing Americans. And yet you had this guy preaching, somehow we're going to reach out and find the moderates. Was that because Obama was being duped, or because, in fact, that's the world Obama wanted to create?
That's the world Obama wanted to create. If you look at his whole political formation, since he was a boy living in Hawaii, who his grandfather had guide him in his teens, a long-time Communist Party adjutant operative, Frank Marshall Davis. And then he goes to college, and then he meets up in Chicago. If you look at the Democratic machine in Chicago and the faction that he attached himself to, it was the old Communist Party faction of the Chicago Democratic Party. That's what raised him. That's where he met Valerie Jarrett, whose parents were party. That's where he met Michelle through Valerie Jarrett. And then the state senator who stepped down to run for Congress and anointed him to replace her was also part of that party apparatus. So this is Obama's America. When he said he wanted to fundamentally transform America, this is what he was dreaming about.
I understand that with the intelligence community. But what about the FBI, which had historically been very conservative, and we were characteristic with wearing a suit and following the rules, etc.? How did that decay?
Well, the FBI was the last to fall, and that also took place at the end of the Robert Mueller 12-year reign over the FBI, when he completely reorganized the FBI from a bottom-up organization, which is the way J. Edgar Hoover designed it to be bottom-up. He was a very powerful director, but you'd open your cases from the field offices, and each of the 56 field office directors from around the country could call him when they needed to. Now, the head of a field office, the special agent in charge, needs to go through 15 different steps in order to communicate directly with the number one person at the FBI. So it cut that off, and it created a huge bureaucratized, centralized from the top apparatus where careerism meant everything. So rather than agents who would spend a lot of time, maybe years of their life, on certain cases, if you're not promoted in 18 months, you're out. This attracted a lot of very avaricious and politicize people to join. So if you look at the national security part of the FBI and the public corruption part of the FBI, they're the most politicized of all. So what really tipped the scale was when Obama loved Mueller's job so much that he asked Congress to allow him to stay beyond his 10-year term and kept him on for 2 years to impose what then James Comey put in as all the DEI politicization of the Bureau. Imagine that on top of a Bureau that had gone from an investigative and law enforcement agency till after 9/11, it was converted into a law enforcement agency and a domestic intelligence service, which we've never had before.
Shouldn't that have been separated? I always argued that when you're fighting crime, you're innocent until proven guilty. When you're fighting terrorism, you're sort of guilty until proven innocent. If you mix the two into the same institution, you're going to corrupt it.
Right. And then you're using intelligence for law enforcement. There are different standards. There's evidence for law enforcement, and you're required to prove that it was obtained legally and with warrants and so forth, and then to be submitted before a court and a trial. With intelligence, none of that is needed. You get the information however you can, from wherever you can, and then you're using that to drive law enforcement investigations. No place west of East Germany does that.
I didn't realize until looking at your book that for 5 years, starting in 2011, the Obama administration's Office of the Director of National Intelligence held Pride Summits, but they were sort of secret. I mean, what was going on?
This is the indoctrination of our intelligence community. These were command performances where officials had to attend these Pride Summits. And even in the FBI, if you were not actively what they call an ally, then you were marked. So if you're just simply a professional saying, look, I don't like what's going on around me, but that's what the president and the attorney general want, I'm just going to just keep my head down and be quiet and do my job, that's a mark against you. So the FBI said, literally, you must embrace LGBTQ, whatever, pride. You must be a, quote, ally of the pride movement. So they're turning a national police into a political police.
I mean, there was a serious effort there to coerce the American people into change whether they want it or not.
Exactly. And when it's done in secret, with no deliberation, with no congressional authorization, with no oversight, and really no recourse, then you are indeed developing a political police system across the country.
The American national security community had its last fundamental redesign in the late 1940s, and it's based on the National Security Act of 1947 and the early Cold War. Do you think we need a fundamental redesign of the system? And if so, how would you do it?
Yeah, well, we need another George Kennan to assess what our foreign adversaries are all about and how to deal with them. You need the bipartisanship that you had with Harry Truman and Harry Truman in the Eisenhower period. They had plenty of fights, but they had a general consensus on who our adversaries were abroad, how they were infiltrating us domestically, and how we needed to have a posture around the world to fight that. But the world has changed so much that we're still on that late 1940s structure and even mentality. So even our defense priorities are designed for that period. Congress keeps throwing more money at defense. That's such a huge waste because our whole grand strategy is obsolete, and therefore our defense structure and spending is obsolete.
I've written that we really have to have a profound rethinking, and that it's going to be very difficult. I mean, Hegseth, for example, has an enormous job trying to get the Pentagon under control and then trying to get it modernized because it's a very bureaucratic, largely obsolete system now. Now, you've suggested that the CIA currently should be dissolved into two different entities, one for intelligence gathering and analysis and one for covert operations. Would you break up the CIA and create these two freestanding separate systems?
Yes, I would divide them in two parts. So it's not abolish the CIA and have no intelligence service. We need intelligence services. But break it into two functional parts. So you have the ones that go out and they collect intelligence, and then others within that analyze that intelligence and they write their estimates and assessments and so forth, and provide that information with their assessments to the president so that he can know what's going on in the world and can decide how to make policy. That's what the CIA was for. Then you'd have a separate, very small covert action service to run covert operations abroad as necessary under presidential control and never on its own. And then I'd shrink both of them, because if you look at the CIA, it's a huge bureaucracy with an even larger unknown number of contractors, and a lot of it's waste. You don't need secret intelligence to spy on the climate or gender or these other things. We also need things that we don't have, like an ability for our people, our agents abroad, to live in those societies and integrate in those societies for the long term, like the old British services did. People know they're Americans and so forth, and people might even know they're CIA, but they can just be there, be our eyes and ears on the ground, and we won't have to rely on the secret services of the local countries to tell us what's going on, which is what happened. And then a lot of the analysis is just unnecessary because there's so much public information. And a lot of the human work is unnecessary because so much is automated and digitized. You don't need so many people. And then a lot of the positions are just obsolete or even worthless. And so you take the best elements of that and you hire other people to come in. We can have a first-rate intelligence service again with first-rate information. But you see president after president since Reagan saying the president's daily brief is pretty much useless. It's not informative. It's not guiding on anything. And so if Democrat and Republican presidents agree on that over decades, then something's fundamentally wrong and has to be fixed.
Do you happen to know, how do the Israelis divide up intelligence?
The Israelis have two main services. They've got the Mossad, which is their international foreign intelligence service, and then they have Shin Bet, which is their domestic security service. And they have others. But if you look at what happened to the Israelis, they're as woke as our intelligence services are. And we saw that on October 7th, where they didn't anticipate any of this. Now, that's horrible intelligence collection, horrible internal security.
Well, and they had talked themselves into a fantasy world in which they were paying Hamas enough to keep Hamas quiet.
Right. So you get into this mentality that your mortal enemy really isn't a moral enemy. He can just be bought off. So that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the moral enemy. And I think a lot of liberal and left-wing Israelis, including in the secret services, feel about Israel that maybe they really are an occupying power. Maybe they're not a legitimate state. Like you see with a lot of Americans, we're a force of evil in the world. Maybe we're not legitimate. Imagine having intelligence officers sworn to defend us who don't believe in our founding principles and think that we are oppressors.
Here at home, domestically, would you split the FBI into a crime-fighting organization and an internal security organization?
Yes, and it's not a question of being anti-FBI. I've always been supportive of the FBI and its missions until you see what's happened to it over the years, and you see not just the corruption within it, but the obsolescence of it. It's still the FBI that J. Edgar Hoover built. We have counterintelligence as a major function to fight foreign espionage against us, but it's really fly swatting. So as good as so many of our counterintelligence officers are, they're just getting the low-hanging fruit. And they're not allowed to stay on cases for a long time. But we have no strategic counterintelligence, like Michelle Van Cleve has recommended for so many years, to actively go out and penetrate adversaries' intelligence services, to disrupt them from the inside and to deceive them so that they can't operate effectively against us. We have no capabilities like that at all.
When you think about all that, it seems to me that you're talking about both a profound reshaping of the CIA and a profound reshaping of the FBI. The second one, I assume, is going to be Kash Patel's job.
Right, and he has the temperament for it. You need a real Wolverine who just doesn't care what people think about him. You can't have some polite lawyer from the Beltway. So he's the right guy to do it. He has his own ideas. I only know what he said in public about them. But the fact is that he's inheriting an obsolete organization. He's inheriting one that's full of waste. It's been reorganized to the point that careerism motivates everything. So you have the worst people going to the top instead of the best people. And then you have it where it's not doing the job that most people in public would expect it to do. So if it's good at investigating and fighting certain kinds of federal crimes, great. Why don't we take that section out of the Bureau with the best people, move it over to the U.S. Marshals, which is relatively a scandal-free law enforcement agency and has been around since the founding fathers. It's the only one. So move that there and move the training, FBI Academy at Quantico, over to the Marshal Service, create a standalone strategic counterintelligence service that has nothing to do with law enforcement. Take other services. We don't need two agencies, FBI and ATF, doing firearms and explosive work. So get those people out. We don't need two drug enforcement administrations, but you've got FBI does counter narcotics as well as DEA. So move them out to DEA and so forth down the line. And then by that time, all you have left at the FBI is HR. So just take it and grind it down. I don't think this requires an act of Congress to do because the FBI has no statutory existence. It was founded by an attorney general memorandum, and it doesn't have a legal charter.
So it was created back, what, in the 1920s?
1908.
1908, wow. That's even pre-J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, it was Teddy Roosevelt, and he wanted to have a federal law enforcement agency, and Congress didn't want one. So he went around it by having the Attorney General write a memorandum detailing agents from the Secret Service, which was under Treasury, to do work for the Justice Department. And that was the root of the FBI. It was a runaround.
I did not know that story.
Yeah.
That's a great story.
Attorney General Bonaparte, he was Napoleon's grandnephew.
Is that right? It all gets more and more interesting. Now, would you go back to the bottom-up system and reallocate power back out of Washington to the special agents in charge?
Sure, absolutely, from the FBI level, but even go further because there are so many functions that the FBI does that usurp the power of localities and states. State police or sheriffs, they will often have a tendency, when the FBI takes over a case without real need to, they'll just surrender their authority over to the FBI, and they'll even deputize FBI agents to enforce state and local laws. And then you see the FBI come in and then they say, well, we need more of a budget. Look at all the great things we're doing to fight crime. What this does is it centralizes all the more law enforcement and instruments of coercion and usurps it from the states and counties and localities. So I would push a lot of those functions back down and then have special agents in charge of the field offices be the originating offices of the cases and not Washington, D.C.
So if Kash Patel called you and said, okay, I'm about to be confirmed, what should I do on my first day? What would you tell him?
I would advise him to lock down the FBI and its electronic access the same way USAID was locked down. There are so many malicious actors within the FBI that you have to get a hold on things before you can actually run things and start to change them. So it's not like we're going to shut things down and there'll be more crime or anything else. No, it's just to pause and to get an idea of what's happening, put the right people in, find the professionals that are inside there, and just make it work.
That's great. Listen, Michael, we've covered a lot of ground. I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. We're going to feature a link to buy it on our show page. And I want to let our listeners know they can follow your recent work by visiting the Center for Security Policy website at centerforsecuritypolicy.org and by following you on X at J. Michael Waller. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, J. Michael Waller. You can get a link to buy his book, Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.